very warm welcome to the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. I'm Frances Christie, one of Marc's trustees, and I'm delighted to be standing in for our chairman, who can't be here tonight, because this is a very, very special evening, this book launch. It's a real milestone, I think, in Outside In's journey. Many of you know that Marc founded this incredible charity in 2006, because he spotted a need to help those artists who have really significant barriers to the art world, whether they be mental health or disability or isolation or deprivation. And since 2006, Marc and the incredible team at Outside In have helped thousands of artists who would otherwise have been completely overlooked. And this book celebrates that. This book celebrates their creative spirit, their unique vision. And I really urge all of you, if you haven't already, they're here. Marc and Grayson will be signing them at the end. They're discounted from the price of £35 to £30. So please do come up at the end. We're thrilled to have Grayson with us. Thank you, Grayson, for all your support. Grayson needs little introduction. He's been on his own journeys on a motorbike through the art world yourself. And I think it's particularly apt that you're here today because you've always challenged convention. And for me, actually, what's most inspiring, in the world of the canon of art history, there's always been this divide between decorative art and so-called fine art. But Grayson has single-handedly changed that with his incredible pots. They are now at the center of any exhibition of so-called fine art. And I hope there'll be more chat about those kind of breaking of boundaries through this conversation. Before I hand over to Marc and Grayson, a few housekeeping rules or information. Should there be a fire drill, it's not a drill, it's real. The emergency exits are behind me and where you came in. The loos are also at the back. We're also filming this conversation, so if you don't want to be on film, just put up your hand. Excellent. Everyone's. And we'll edit you out later. And on that note, I've got a few thank yous as well. First of all, a huge thanks to the Paul Hamlyn Foundation for hosting us in this incredible space. At Lund Humphreys, Marc particularly wanted to thank Lucy Clark, Sarah Thorogood, and also James Pito. And also at Outside In, to the incredible team who work with Marc and who work tirelessly throughout the year, particularly for this event. A big hats off to Matt Forbesdale, who many of you know. A huge thanks to Grayson for being here. And last but not least, to all of our artists, without whom this book, this charity, none of it would be possible. At the end, we are going to do a little bit of Q&A. So start thinking of your questions as they're talking. And at the end, put your hand up, I'll come and find you, and you can have the mic. So without further ado, over to Grayson and Marc.
Right. Away we go.
Good evening.
Right. Hello.
Hello.
Right.
Yes. Well, it's a really wonderful opportunity to be able to talk and chat about some of the themes and subjects in the area of sort of art that I know you are very interested in and feel passionate about. And to sort of kick it off, I think it might be quite interesting to know a bit about what you think there is to learn and the influence of sort of excluded or outsider art, whatever term you want to use.
Yeah, well, that's a good question to start on, isn't it? It's the term. It's nowadays, we're in a kind of where words are so loaded in our present age. Do we call them outsider artists? And then, well, if you bring them inside, then they're part of the inside, and so therefore they're just part of the mass of people we call artists. It's like when I first started making pottery, I'd say, the potters, they live in a kind of lagoon of craft, but then I wanted to go out onto the ocean of art. And so therefore there's a sort of a plus and a minus in having a kind of protected characteristic. Are we all together as artists, or are there kind of, are you going to dine out on your outsiderness?
Yeah, no, that's true.
And so it's sort of like, okay, if you want to come in, then you'll be judged like all the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And I think so it's an interesting sort of category thing, just how we describe outsider artists. I mean, saying that, I think that, a big part of the attraction of any artist is their kind of context and their backstory and their biography. And, outsider artists more than most in many ways.
I mean, there's a sort of dilemma where the sort of construct the art world presents is that it sort of likes to label and categorize art, especially from the sort of art historical perspective. You have like movements and styles. Whereas the issue around outsider art on the one hand is that it's seen as a sort of, a type of work by artists who, for whatever reason haven't or don't fit. And it's a certain type of work that people like Dubuffet, like Roger Cardinal and others sort of labeled, in a way as different. But the only commonality amongst that work is the fact that there's no stylistic commonality across all of that. It's purely because the people are different and actually don't conform, at some level. There's like an ethical issue there. And I quite like that some of our artists have reclaimed the term outsider, because the point you're making is about it's a feeling of exclusion. It's a sort of
it kind of mirrors like identity politics, in the rest of the world. In that it used to be that we're all the press was always to be communal and we're all equal, and now suddenly everyone wants to be different. And so it's like a kind of it's like a squeeze box thing. No, we're all the same. We're all equal. No, we're not. We're all different. And make your fucking mind up.
I know when we chatted earlier, Grayson, you said about, because it had the same impact on me, but the sort of Hayward exhibition of the outsiders, that was seminal. In my life, it was seminal in terms of broadening my understanding and realising there's a whole other world of work and artists that I hadn't thought about or known. I mean, do you want to say a bit about what that exhibition meant to you?
It was an explosion going off in my eyes. Yeah, 79, the Victor Musgrave collection at the Hayward Gallery, the Outsiders. I came up I think we drove up from Braintree in a 2CV. Just one of the tutors sort of said, I think you would like this show. He sort of came up and we went and saw it, and we were with a couple of other students, and we were blown away by it. Yeah, we were completely like, oh my God. And from that moment, I was always interested, and a few years later, when I got a decent motorbike, I got on and one of the things, on my first European motorbike trip, I went to Lausanne and went to the Art Brut Museum there, definitely, because I was just completely hooked on it.
I was an art student at the time, and I saw it as well, and I remember thinking that it sort of slightly unpicked what I was trying to achieve through being taught to create in an art school establishment, because there's all these artists and artworks. There's like stockings full of stuff made with the figures. There's all this stuff, and you think it's absolutely beautiful and profound, but it's made by people who've never been schooled or taught or been through an art, training. And I remember thinking, do I need to be doing this?
That is the crux philosophical question that it throws up. Is that one of the biggest obstacles that anybody who decides they're going to be an artist has to face is self-consciousness, and yet outsider art is often characterized by people who are spontaneously creating without that sort of, I'm very aware of it as I become more successful and more well known. I have a kind of amphitheater of spectators in my head who are always looking down at what I'm doing. And what's he up to now? What's he up to now? And if you're spontaneous, you're just dealing with stuff in the moment, you don't have that. No. And so when you opt in to being, I'm going to be an artist in the art world, you're also opting for the burden of self-consciousness, which is no small thing when you're trying to be creative. It's the enemy.
It is. That inner sort of critical voice or that awareness of an audience's reception of what you're creating,
Yeah, and so it's, because in some ways, if you're a kind of, that you are blessed with living in the Garden of Eden of innocence or whatever, and making things, then the art will come to you and go, oh, that's lovely. Where you're not trying to kind of, oh, please look at me, like all the other artists are, because and so I think that relationship is sort of crux in it, And of course, there's a spectrum of interaction with the art world. You know, there's artists who, you know, perhaps didn't go to art school, but then they're happy to engage with the art world, you know, and stuff like that. So there's all sort of variation. It's not a pure... I'm a big fan of nuance.
Yeah, I know.
Totes.
I mean,
that was an oxymoron, by the way, using millennial language and the word nuance. They shouldn't be in the same sentence.
this sort of, this sort of outsider dilemma, like something that like Henry Darger presents.
Yeah.
You know, this idea that somebody in isolation is creating this huge body of work that is only then discovered after his death and saved from destruction. And
he's the kind of Andy Warhol of outsider art in that he's kind of like set the bar pretty high for all the other artists, you know. Because, you know, Picasso and Andy Warhol, they really kind of screwed all other contemporary artists because they were so productive and they were such revolutionary, they were such a revolutionary moment in 20th century art that they made everybody else look a bit kind of not very hard-working or interesting. And that was really hard work for them. And I think that Henry Darger, what he did, you know, he's like such a pure dream of an outsider artist.
Yeah.
You know, and it's a bit spooky,
Yeah.
you know, and very, very prolific.
Yeah.
And beautiful and clever and, you know, interesting. I went into the archive because I did a thing once at the museum, the Folk Art Museum, and they took me to the archive and they were talking about, at one point in his life, you know, he was a janitor in a hospital. He was spending most of his income on getting black and white reproductions blown up because this was in the age before, you know, he didn't think he could draw, so he always traced. Yeah. And so he would get illustrations out of comics and magazines, and he would get them photographically blown up at great expense at the chemist, so he could then trace them to the right size to fit his drawings. And I just think, wow, you know, this is someone who is a dedicated artist. You know, and I was just blown away by that he, you know, in his isolation, and he was putting so much effort and resources into the images.
Yeah. No, and it's an almost sort of catch-22 situation where, you know, to achieve that level of credence and, you know, as that sort of artist, you almost have to be not discovered until you're gone, you know? There's a sort of impossibility in the scenario that what makes him such a significant artist is because of the fact that he produced all this work, he died, and then...
Yeah, because one of the things in the culture generally, you know, is one of the things you have to do is to learn to deal with fame. And a lot of people in whatever genre you're operating in, they can't deal with it and they crash and burn. Yeah. You know, I was lucky I didn't become famous until I was about 43. Yeah, yeah. You know, and I'd had therapy. Yeah. But it's like, I suppose there's a sort of sense where there's a set of skills the art world requires of you in order to navigate it. You know, it's not just about being very talented or creative or very eloquent, because being creative doesn't necessitate those skills. But if you have those additional skills, then you can navigate it successfully. But if you are, you know, if you have like a disability, if you have a mental health issue, or you never leave your room, or for whatever reason, you're just never going to be able to participate. And I suppose what for me Outside In was about trying to, you know, reach out and form a bridge, you know, and that idea of sort of so much work and so much art just being lost because of that lack of gaze or awareness. It's a whole set of skills, and it's increasingly hard now, I think, you know, the sort of additional skill set and resources you need now to be an artist compare even when I started are so much more and much more inaccessible now because of costs mainly. So I think it is, to become an artist now is harder than ever. Yeah, no, completely. Well, plus it's all been done. Oh, well, most of it. But, you know, in terms of, you know, what, I know we've had a few chats before, but, you know, what would you say the lessons or the impact of sort of this sort of work has had on you as a person and as an artist? Huge impact. You know, I was writing a piece for a catalogue earlier this year, and, you know, I would cite, you know, what we call outsider art, folk art, or whatever, as the biggest influence on my work. Yeah, you know, hugely. you know, a lot of my favourite artists, I refer to them, you know, people. Like at the moment I'm working on a group of work and I've got an Aloise Corbet's book, I've got a Madge Gill book sitting there, I've got a Wolfley book sitting there, you know, and I'm kind of constantly going like that. What bits can I rip off of them? Or maybe I'm just channeling their spirit. They're like my spirits, you know, like spirit guys, like Madge Gill had,
But they are like preeminent in terms of your influence. They're the people you really feel most.
No, just at the moment. I mean, they're different artists at different times, you know, but they're some of my favourites. I mean, I was completely obsessed with Henry Darger for quite a long while. And he was really influential on me.
And the lessons.
It was the story. It was that idea, because for me personally, the way I developed as an artist, I think, even though I've been through the art school system in a classic way, I think that many of the template for my creativity, I felt was mirrored in some of the stories of these artists. I thought, I'm making art like them, despite the fact that I've been through art school. I felt the way that their biography and their obsessions and their style sort of played out in their work. I thought I saw myself mirrored in them, and I think that's why I so loved them and liked them, you know, because I felt I was one of them, even if I'd been to art school. I was an honorary, honorary outsider artist. Too bloody self-aware.
The other thing that I think that sort of happens amongst sort of artists who find their own ways of making and creating is that they'll often use materials and ways of working that aren't necessarily sort of taught or accepted commonly as sort of art processes. And I was thinking, we chatted a bit about Judith Scott and there's Nina Kalu, who've spoken a bit about as well. And there's something about, you know, actually breaking the idea of it being a particular technique or skill, but actually you can use other things and ways to make.
Well, you know, if you look at 20th century art history, practically every material has been used, but I would say that, you know, one of the signature things and one of the delights of what we call outsider art is that people just, you know, they just use what's to hand. And that's very much my experience, especially as a young artist, was like, you know, what's to hand. And I think, you know, when people are, oh, I can't make art, I haven't got a studio. And I go, you've got a kitchen table and a sketchbook, haven't you? You know, look at her, look at Judith Scott, she's got some wool. You know, or whatever, some sticks. Or, you know, there was a British outsider artist that was in some institution, he just made it out of hair, I think. Like he just collected hair.
Angus McPhee, no, it's grass.
So it's like, don't make excuses, you know. Just get on with it.
So, I mean, but to do that and to sort of bypass convention takes a bit of courage, doesn't it? It's either...
Do they know they're doing it, though? That's the thing. I think the thing is, you know, that we posit it like that, but it's only scary when you know you're breaking the law. You know, the adrenaline is not going to hit if you don't know you're, you know, if it's just what your unconscious processes are kind of suggesting to you, then that's fine, that's your world. You know, I started dressing up as a woman before I knew there was such a thing as a transvestite for 2 years. So it's like, and then I found out that was a thing. Like, oh, there's other people that do it. You know. So it's like, you know, if you're making art out of hair, it's like, you know, suddenly find out there's a whole kind of history of, you know, conceptual art. It'd be a bit of a downer, wouldn't it?
True.
Oh, because I remember talking to art students once, you know, and he's saying, "Oh yes, worst thing you can do when you have an idea is Google it." Just because someone else is bound to have done it.
I suppose there's something about, and in the book as well, I think, it's about the intent for why people are making some of the work. You know, is that it isn't always about, it's very rarely often about commodity. They're not really worried about selling it. Often it can be about healing, or it can be about obsession, or it can be just a gift, or, you know, something that is trying to encapsulate or express something that is hard to say, you know, and it might be an experience they've had. And I think what interests me and what I was trying to do in the book was to show that, you know, it can sit within the individual, and it can be for a variety of reasons, which are quite broad, you know. There's a whole gamut of why people might create. But we have such a sort of set, sort of linear way of thinking. On the whole, but people create in a certain way.
Well, we say that, don't we?
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if you peeled off the contemporary art school market-led flesh off of a lot of artists. You'd find an outsider artist in the middle of them.
Maybe.
You know, you'd find someone that was making things because that, you know, because they have sort of an impulse, and they've somehow had it kind of knocked into shape that's marketable.
Yeah, or ruined, you know, or somehow, like, you know, led away from that through the process. I mean, art school's quite often a sort of very sort of stripping and sort of revealing process, isn't it? Where you sort of, you lose that, what brought you to create as a sort of initially. I've met so many students who've gone through that process who've completely lost what it was that brought them to want to be creative through the process of being an art student, because of that sort of idea that it's about a progression, or it's sort of an idea of a linear journey that you get to be better over time. You know, but a lot of the artists in the book will be working in a certain way and will have worked in that way, you know, from the beginning. And I know you've talked a bit about they might have started doodling, and you know, it's over time.
I doubt their first work was their best.
Well, I don't know. I sometimes I would challenge that.
Well, I would say if your second work is worse than your first work, then you're doomed as an artist.
Or is it?
You had a fluke. You had a lucky fluke with the first one.
But
it's
maybe,
all downhill from here. That's not an art career.
But maybe you have a succession of flukes. Maybe it isn't about, you know, like good or bad in that way. You know, maybe it's not. Maybe it's just like.
I think all artists in their head think they're the best artists in the world.
Depends if you think you're an artist.
Yeah, but I think you know, when you're putting it down, you're trying to satisfy yourself, and everybody, you know, even when a child will have a version of that. Oh, I like that bit, and so the next drawing they'll capitalise on that, and over time. And so I think all artists are testing out in the physical. And then it's a call and response totally. You know, they're going constantly like, oh, that works, that bit not so good. I'll do more of that for the next one. And you can see it in the work of a lot of outsider artists, how their own vocabulary, their distinct vocabulary of mark making and colour and whatever becomes more sophisticated and assured. And, you know.
I'm going to have to agree to disagree.
That's all right. If whatever romantic vision of the spontaneous creator you hold in, it's fine.
Yeah. I don't know, I was thinking, you know, when some of the examples we talked about, Wolfley or Doug, or some of the people in the Prince on collection, you know, there's artists that have an inherent style and way of making. It is just that, you know, and I can't see that journey quite in the same way, you know.
What interests me quite often is you can see in the way, particularly in the way people draw people, you can see what era they were in because of the popular way of depicting people at the time, you know, whether it's be cartoons or whatever it is, but you can see, you can almost look at a drawing, even an outsider art, and go, yeah, that's a 1920s outsider art face, definitely.
No, I agree.
So I think there is a sort of unconscious seepage.
Oh, completely.
You know, these people, often they're sort of billed as people who are isolated from the culture, but they're not. You know, they're just as influenced. No, I mean, Henry Darger loved watching, you know, movies and stuff, and he's got quotes from movies in his work and stuff.
But they probably, you know, what they might have missed though was that when they went, you know, if you went to school and you were taught about perspective and colour theory and all the other stuff, that seems to people feel.
I really must learn these things.
But most people, I've said everyone in this room will have been taught art in a very formulaic and predictable way, and I think that is just what sort of, you know, it actually is like a sort of hurdle that most people never get across.
But I think all artists would have seen an artwork or something, an image that they would have somehow been influenced by. You know, I think that even if it was at a church or in a magazine, you know, or a photograph or something, they would have seen something that they were latching onto. You know, images. I don't think it's, you know, I don't have this sort of vision that they just sort of, you know, most of these people probably started making art when they were relatively mature, and so they'd seen a lot of stuff.
They will have, but it's different from being taught, from just being, we're all, you know, looking at advertising, walking around the street, seeing clothes, seeing people. Inevitably, we you know, absorb, you know, some of our culture, some of the style of our time, the fashion of the period. But actually, if you're taught that art is made in a certain way and requires a certain set of skills, that, you know...
Yeah, I would push back against that. I would say that art school nowadays, you know...
Talk about school. before.
School, nowadays not even taught art at school nowadays because
well,
it's not deemed as a subject where you're ever going to have a chance of making a living. You know.
No.
There speaks an artist.
The other thing, Grayson, we touched upon was about some of the places you visited and we've seen together. And I thought it might be quite nice because of a place I really love is a place in Chartres called Picassiette, which is made by this wonderful sort of street sweeper and grave digger called Raymond Isidore, who sort of mosaicked his house completely.
He started round the sink, I think.
He did, and then he went everything.
And then it grew.
Everything. And he lived in a small house in which he actually had mosaicked the sort of cooker, the shower, his wife's sewing machine. I mean, he had 3 kids and lived in this space, but you've been there, haven't you?
Yeah. I mean, it is bonkers. Yeah. And it is completely, every surface of the garden, the whole house is completely encrusted, you know. And yeah, it's a thing. But, you know, even that, I sometimes think, you know, that is a trope of outsider art, you know, sticking things in concrete and plaster. That's definitely, you know, if there's an outsider art look, it's sticking things in plaster.
And mosaicing it.
Yeah, because, you know, it's something that people, because it's something people can have a go at.
Yeah.
And it kind of, a lot of people, you know, that's their, I don't know what it is, it's sort of, you know, they want to decorate their house. I think that's great. You know, they want to make their house into it's a religious impulse almost. I think it's another powerful thing. Yeah. There's a sort of I think a lot of folk artists, they have their own kind of quite often quite elaborate belief systems that they then kind of illustrate in their work. And I think that's really interesting because I really identify with that. You know, because as human beings we are kind of narrative, we're meaning makers and we want a narrative. And if person, you know, is isolated, if for whatever reason, they make up their own narrative and then they make art about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that, you know, that's good. Good to have a subject. I've always been jealous of like religious artists because they've got an obvious subject.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's something about spirituality or using your work as a sort of means to engage and sort of tap into the sort of unconscious or subconscious. People like Madge Gill, you touched upon, you know, and sort of other artists. There's some artists in the book that make reference to the idea that, you know, that there's an artist called Jonathan Petit, who's one of our artists, who he's a sort of he goes to a sort of medium, this church of sort of, you know, which believes in the use of mediums, and he wakes up in the night at 3 o'clock in the morning when the world is all silent. And he sits on his sofa and he puts up his canvas and his paints and he waits till he's visited by this sort of presence, and then we'll just paint this picture in one complete sitting in that, and then that was it, and he'll do it, and it's just that process. And I mean, the work is amazing. I've got to say, you know, regardless of the sort of unusual approach to making, but there's something about what he's doing that really interests me. You know, that idea that you can.
A lot of so-called sort of, you know, established artists in some ways. You know, you just imagine kind of Rothko in his studio thinking, shall I kill myself or shall I do another spiritual blob? You know, or like, you know, El Greco painting by candlelight. You know, like, you know, waiting for that kind of holy flame to come down into his work or something. Yeah. And so I think, you know, I often think that, you know, that there's not that barrier. It's just that some of us have been lucky.
Very lucky.
It's self-promotion, I think.
And what?
You have to be good at self-promotion to be an artist.
Are there any outsider artists who are good self-promoters? Were they gifted with the spontaneous ability to self-promote?
Well, you. I mean, the artist that springs to mind in terms of the whole dilemma around, you know, Albert Loudon's work. You know Albert Loudon, who is a British sort of outsider artist who had an exhibition at the Serpentine back in the, I don't remember when it is, late 70s, I think, probably. Yeah. And he was really celebrated as this amazing sort of, you know, outsider artist, never been shown before, never exhibited, had this exhibition at the Serpentine. And then he just fell out of grace because he'd gone from being this person who sort of was not part of the establishment to being part of the establishment. And I used to get letters from Albert quite often going, And he still would say, like, am I an outsider artist? What does it mean to be an outsider artist?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, that is, isn't it? When you kind of like, you're sort of part of your mystique.
Yeah,
And then
goes.
you've gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why I've always come from a position of deep cynicism. Just any, you know, any kind of spiritual stuff that does leak out, it's a bonus for me.
What about the benefits of being creative? I mean, just because people often will dismiss a lot of outsider art, some of the artists' works within the book as sort of therapy or therapeutic, but actually is there a sense that being creative is therapeutic in and of itself? And is it like a value judgment about certain people's work?
I think a lot of artists, you know, get a pleasure out of it in the same way. Just, you know, if you talk to any artist who does anything, you know, they enjoy the process. It's a physical therapy. It's just like, you know, doing. I often say I like the drudgery. There is a limit. There's a limit. You know, I spent the day making tiles. It's like, yeah, I mean, there is obvious, because it's like externalizing what's going on. And I mean, and often you're dealing with your unconscious, which is difficult to kind of intellectualize and make, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, to put it out in a way that is sort of understandable. And so an artwork is a kind of great way for dealing with that kind of massive, tangled, inchoate feelings and impulses, because you know, it'll come out, especially as you become more adept, it will come out in the style and the palette and the technique, and that will say, you know, it's not explicitly written down, you know, I am feeling really depressed, or I am, you know, having a manic moment. But in the art, we're going, yeah, manic moment. Definitely. Yeah.
I mean, there's sort of, you know, the whole idea of the growth of art therapy, and people like, you know, Adamson and the early exponents of that, where they've seen the sort of benefits of just being creative, and that it has a sort of healing force and a power for someone to address some of these sort of issues and life challenges they might face. But then, and there's the sort of, you know, where I can see that art can be in and of itself really sort of helpful for a person. You know, and I worry that, you know, we are, on the whole, maybe not getting that benefit as a society, you know, that because people are either being put off it or sort of removed from that.
I think the big thing is that, you know, nowadays, especially with the internet, we have at our fingertips every image in the world ever made, and the examples of the highest achievements of culture are completely available. We live in a time of cultural kind of cornucopia. You know, I mean, you and I, we grew up as children in a time of cultural scarcity, you know. But now it's very tricky because you're going to compare yourself to that, you know. And I think that there's this, I think one of the kind of things that perhaps gives outsider artists an impulse is that they're not so self-conscious in comparing themselves to other artists. Whereas the minute you kind of say, I'm going to become an artist, you're kind of immediately pitting yourself against art history. And you know, that's the reason a lot of people are frightened of being creative, is because they compare themselves to, you know, the things they see. Yeah,
it's really difficult, isn't it? I mean, I remember studying and painting, and then, you know, being exposed to what I thought was sort of, you know, what I really loved, you know, as art, but realising, but actually the lesson is that isn't you, isn't it? It's actually, there's something else, which is, you might have that model of something which you really admire and love, but that isn't something you should aspire to. That's a different thing, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, every artist has their own career and their own sort of standards of what is good.
Actually, maybe we've got to the point, France, so we can have some more questions from the audience. That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you, Grayson. That's wonderful, as ever. So, anybody have any questions? Say thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think there's no such thing as a stupid question. No,
That's good, it's true.
I'm sorry, I'm going to do the thing where you get up to ask a question and then you say something. But I remember being in a project where we had to do 8 pieces of painting, and they divided us up into age groups. and then they filmed us. And what was so clear was that very young children made definite decisions about what they wanted to do, were very clear, weren't tentative, and every age group you went through, you became more and more and more tentative.
Yeah.
And going back to the iPad, I do think the best thing we can do for children is make sure they're surrounded by materials, because I think that makes a huge difference to children.
I mean, people are very creative with digital technology now, you know, on TikTok and all this sort of thing. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, digital things are necessarily are putting a stop to creativity. But what's good about physical materials is that they're limited and they fight back. Yeah. Whereas a computer, if you're good enough on a computer, it'll do anything.
So do you think we value children's art enough? Because there's a lot of talk about art, and it has value when we put it on a wall and when we put it in a valued space. But we don't do that with children's art. Their parents value it enormously. But we don't do that. But it is the result of definite decisions, of effort. It is, you know, great stuff. But with education, there's always the view that it's a step on the road to getting better and doing proper stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen many children's art that I'd necessarily want to hang on the wall. You know, when we look at our own children, we go, oh my God, look at that. You know, and I remember my daughter, when she was, oh my God, you know, it's amazing what you can do. And then you realise, you know, it's just because you're a dad.
But I think there are lessons to be learnt from children's art. I think there's something, you know, that Paul Klee obviously really much, you know, very much admired children's art and strove to sort of like, you know, sort of mirror that sort of intuitive and natural, you know, way of making. And similarly, Picasso spoke about, you know, spent his whole life to try and learn to become a child again, to unlearn all the crap he'd learnt through, you know, formality and training. So to me, there's a huge lesson in there, but that's my perspective, you know, and I think I would disagree with Grayson. I think there's some wonderful children's art and really beautiful stuff that I would probably hang on my wall and probably could hang on any gallery and read better than 90% of the shit that's in there.
It makes me think... Children's art makes me think a bit of AI, you know, in that, you know, like AI does amazing images, but I just go, yeah, it's an amazing image, but it's done by AI. And I think that I see an amazing image, I go, yeah, it's done by a kid though, and they haven't had to face up to the human condition and the self-consciousness, and because a lot of art, it's like when you see something done by a knowing human, and they've had to learn the skills and they've had to cross all those thresholds. That's when it's amazing. That's when if we see an amazing musician who's practiced and they've become this amazing master of the music. That is a big part of what we're responding to is that human is doing that thing with all of the barriers and all the self-consciousness and all the training and all the comparison to all the other musicians. They've become the best person at it. And that's why we're moved by it. Whereas if it's like, oh, they did that because, you know, just because they're, you know, it's a machine or whatever, then it's like, yeah, good. It sounds the same, but it's by a machine. I'm not interested. And when I look at children's art, I think that looks like kids' art.
But then that's the sort
of
thing
that's said. Do.
But isn't that what's said about a lot of like art created by people with learning disabilities? There's a sort of, you know, dismissing of work that seems childish or sort of naive.
There's good ones and bad ones. You know, I'm quite big on value judgment.
And no, I know you are, but I don't agree that, you know, it's about sort of self-awareness and self-knowledge. I know from my experience of working for many years with artists with learning disabilities, and I've got Cheryl here who's probably have a similar experience and understanding about, sorry Cheryl, put you on the spot there. You know, is it about, you know, is there an innate ability to be creative that can allow you to make and have a sort of sense of colour and composition? There is, isn't there? There is.
Yeah, there's good outsider artists, and it's in this. You know, I wouldn't like to do a survey when I judge the Kursler Awards, right, which is art sent in from people who are in prisons, right, and it was always anonymous. We'd have thousands of drawings all piled up in this house, and we'd look round, and the only thing we'd know is what institution they were in, okay. And you always knew that if they had a red label on, they were from what they called a special hospital, right? And the proportion of good work coming from special hospitals was always much higher. Okay?
No, I get it.
So for me, you know, there is that.
Francis? One more
What? Yeah,
got
what is it?
question.
Hi, you probably can't see me, but I'll kind of wave. Hello.
Hi.
So I have a question, and I guess it's quite leading, so I'm really interested to see what this is going to do and put the cat amongst pigeons. Is there a difference between value and worth in outsider art?
Well, it depends who's saying it, isn't it? If
Exactly.
you know, as a spectator and someone who loves outsider art, I'm going to look at it from my point of view. To the artist who made it, they're going to, you know, that gives them their experience of a thing. I mean, in the end, what makes art good? You know, I did a whole brief lecture about it. It's a collective agreement. You know, it's the artists themselves, it's their teachers, it's the curators, it's the critics, it's the public, it's the dealers, it's the auction houses. You know, and you know, it's a consensus by a cabal. That's what makes God. And over time, you know, the greatest kind of judge of quality is time. You know, if you go to the back rooms of a Spanish cathedral, there's a lot of bad medieval art.
But the cabal that's, you know, it holding power influence at any one time is swayed.
It loves out this idea that you're somehow excluded.
No,
there was a whole Venice Biennale about
I haven't
outsider
finished
art.
my point. I was going back to saying, looking at sort of, say, look at the Victorian period. You know, you get a lot of sort of, you know, sentimental, mawkish pictures of animals, or, you know, kids playing, or even, you know, the pre-Raphaelites at some extent.
Are you biased against sentimental or mawkish things?
I am indeed.
You surprised
me. Mr. Lancier is my favourite part of the story. But, you know, but then you have someone like Richard Dadd, obviously, who then, you know, had sort of famously, you know, had an episode of psychosis, murdered his father whilst out walking, spent the rest of his life in the Bethlehem Hospital, producing these amazing series of incredible sort of like cleverly detailed paintings. But, you know, they were looked on as sort of curiosities, and he was seen as a sort of, you know, an outcast and a sort of, you know, a bit of a pariah. But when it comes to now, you know, you'd be seeing him in the Royal Academy. You wouldn't be seeing those sort of, you know, Victorian greats of the period in the same light. You know, so who says what's good and bad of any time is only within a certain set of thinking and blinkers, you know?
Yeah, I mean, now you know, if he hadn't have murdered his dad, you know, would we be looking at him as saying, you know, and so
he wouldn't be in the hospital.
My question kind of follows up from that in a way, which is, Grayson, because you're really resisting this division between the two worlds, and the only thing that you really picked up on was the idea of self-consciousness, if I'm not wrong, which you mentioned quite often, the self-consciousness that becomes with being
There's degrees of it. I wouldn't say it's a switch that you suddenly become completely self-conscious.
Yeah. Is that the only kind of distinction, and is it a prerequisite of being an artist, or is it?
No, it's just something it's a burden you take on when you're trying to make a career of it. You're choosing to make a career of it. It's just, you know, that's another thing. You choose to make a career of it and make your living at it. Then it really piles on.
And I want to also ask Mark if you think that, I mean, you can't really generalise, because I know you've dealt with many different kinds of artists, but whether the lack of self-consciousness is something you'd like to comment on in the artists that you've worked with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of, there's an unknown about, I mean, I suppose think of someone like Judith Scott, you know, somebody, I don't know, what do we mean by being that self-awareness? What does that, is it self-awareness that what you're creating may be presented in a certain context, that you will understand the context in which it's being presented.
Yes.
You know?
I think that's what I'm saying.
So there are a lot of artists who make great art who don't understand the journey their work goes on. So the idea that Judith Scott knew that her work could be exhibited and hung and bought for lots of money she wouldn't be conscious of that in that way. You can't assume that knowledge because she's non-verbal, making work in a very intuitive way. So the benefit and the purpose for her was making these amazing sculptures. She wasn't thinking of it going into a gallery and becoming a wall. Yeah.
And that might have been to her benefit.
Absolutely to her benefit. All right.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's her benefit. That, you know, for her doing that like that and being oblivious to the context which her art eventually ended up in, you know, it works for her. But of course, if you're not in her position with her handicap or whatever, then you're forced to face up to this thing of, I am entering the art world and I want it. You know, I want to be accepted, and then all of a sudden you've got all that stuff coming. So there is, you know, if you say, oh, I don't want to be part of the art world, I'm just going to do this thing just for myself, in a way, that's a luxury.
Yeah.
You know, and it's great. If you want to do it, fine. But the minute you say, I want to enter the value system and all the judgments, then you've just got to accept that. And it's what I say, you go out the lagoon and you go onto the ocean and you've got to be prepared to get wet.
Thank you, Grayson. Any questions? Sorry, there's people. Charles.
Yeah, I'm not sponsored by Lund Humphreys in asking this question, by the way, but slightly different question to each of you. Mark, what surprised you through the process of writing the book? What did you learn about outsider art through the book? And Grayson, having looked at the book, what struck you that hadn't struck you before about it?
What did I learn? I mean, it's interesting, the process of writing the book, which is sort of like a distillation of 30 years working with artists in one shape or another. It's like, so having that time to sort of think, what are those lessons I'd learned? Because I hadn't really, I haven't any sort of sense of what I believe in terms of my value base and why the work's important. But sitting there and actually trying to distill it down and realise the important lessons were about judgments and value, about the judgments people make about what is art and the reasons why people make it. And that's what interests me. And that really came to the fore, is that there were people like Chaz Waldron who made his work about, you know, his love for his wife, and that was the purpose for it, you know, or people who, you know, who were just trying to document something that had happened to them, you know, that creativity can have that purpose and have its own space and own rationale outside of the art market and the museum and gallery system.
I mean, I think looking at the book, what I was struck by was I thought there was sort of parallel art history here. Because I've been a fan of outsider art for over 40 years. So I was sort of looking at it and thinking, they're the artists I'm familiar with, and they're ones I'm not familiar with. And I was viewing it in the same way as I'd be looking at any art, in that I'm familiar with those things, and I'm not so familiar. So I like, oh, they're my favourites. The old ones are my favourites. And I'm looking at the new ones going, I'll come round to that maybe. You know, and every so often, Judith Scott's a good example, actually, of someone I've only heard about in the last probably 5 years or something. And I'm thinking, oh, yeah, I like this work now. And that's the way, you know, familiarity is underrated in our assessment of beauty. You know, a lot of the time what we see as beautiful is just familiar. And so, you know, in any kind of learning situation. So that's when looking through the book is thinking, yeah, there's up and coming outsider artists. And so that's something that I'm willing to acknowledge, you know. But it seemed like a parallel art history.
Thank you.
So talking of the book, I'm sure everyone would love to buy a book. I have two final questions, and then, ladies and gentlemen, we can move on to our book signing. So final two questions.
Hello, yeah, I was going to say to the both of you, I was lucky enough to be part of the creative team for the Grayson Heritage Project, which is the local mental health hospital in our area. And through Outside In and the Step Up programme, I was trained in workshops, and it was like a really, really cathartic time for me as an artist, because my mum had dementia. I went on to the dementia wards as well as going on to the high security psychiatric wards, and we did work with the artists who were actually hospitalised, you know, various different workshops that we chose through Rachel Johnson, who was from Chichester University. And at the end of it, we came up with an idea for the exhibition, and it was called Therapeutic Endeavours. And myself personally, having been in hospital quite a few times, use my creativity to help with my mental health. And I think that that's something that shines through in a lot of outsider art, that maybe conventional artists, inverted commas, or artists of the art world don't, you know, I think quite often they're sort of like, oh, I'm commissioned to do this, or I've got to do that, or I must go to this meeting. Do you know what I mean? It's very, very self-promoting, whereas a lot of people with mental health issues would find that very, very difficult. And I think what Outside In has done as a whole for me, having sort of been with it since 2009, the exhibition that Mark had at Parent House Gallery, is it's actually been life-saving, because being told, oh, you've got a piece and it's going to be in Sotheby's, yeah, or you're talking about my work having a chance to talk about my work at the Royal Academy, or having an exhibition in Parent House Gallery, or whatever, is actually the ethos of the charity, yeah. And I think, in a way, what Grayson said earlier, it's very true that for myself as an artist, I'm quite lucky because I can try and commentate on my feelings and withdraw some of my feelings that I've had when I've been very, very ill, and some of my work's about that. And it's sort of like a visual diary sort of thing, my work, but it's also incredibly therapeutic. I mean, Grayson, I would imagine that you probably found, I mean, my mum was a hypnotherapist, psychotherapist. I know your wife was a hypnotherapist, psychotherapist, I think I'm right in saying. You know, and I think the whole idea that, you know, Mark has come up with this outside in has been such a lifesaver to so many of us artists, would you agree? You know, I mean, literally, you know, he's an absolute superstar and has given people opportunities which, you know, to me, I may not sell much art. I only sell some art when I'm doing, you know, making money for the community programme or something like that, and I sell my work then. But, you know, he's actually has brought the outside in. And it's like you've got this sort of standard thing of, right, okay, you go to art college, and then if you're good, you go to Goldsmiths or St Central St Martin's or wherever, do you know what I mean, the top colleges. And it's like that's the one route in, and this is where Mark is like, actually, that shouldn't be the one in. I mean, you look at some of the fabulous, you know, we've got Madge Gill up there now, all of the outsider art is... We're lucky in a way because we don't have to think, oh, we've got a commission to do this. We're just doing it from the heart and for therapeutic reasons. And I just want to thank Mark so much because he's literally saved my life. Literally.
Thank you, Tess. I actually think that's the perfect conclusion. I think that says it all about how amazing the charity has been, and that at this point in our journey, that it's sort of that Lund Humphreys have very kindly published this amazing book to celebrate all our artists. So, thank you very much, Mark and Grayson. A big round of applause, please. For our